It's time for the biggest story of the day. This is What Made the Cut with JJ and Alex on 97.5, the KSL Sports Zone.
And The Cut is always brought to you by the folks at the family of dealerships in the Doug Smith family. Doug Smith, Chevy, Jeep, Dodge, Ram, Subaru, Kia, and now, of course, Mitsubishi's under the family right there in American Fork, Spanish Fork, and, of course, in Linden. Travis Yost on the program here with us, covers the NHL for TSN. Travis, you're going to the game tonight at Delta Center, man. That's exciting.
Yeah, I got to do a little Montreal Canadiens scouting, I guess. How you guys doing?
Tough draw. Well, we're interested. We're always interested to see what people think when they come in and kind of see what's going on and what Ryan Smith and Bill Armstrong and Chris Armstrong are putting together. But this team right now is trying to figure some things out. They are not looking good over their last 10 games. They've lost 8 of their last 10. And that's, it's been an up and down year for them. They're still in somewhat of the hunt. They are still above 500 technically. So what do you think so far of this Utah Hockey Club? Because I was reading something I think on ESPN today that said that they gave them a C+ on kind of their midseason grades. Where do you have this Utah Hockey Club?
Yeah, I think I'd probably grade them a little better than that. But it's interesting, right? I actually filed something at TSN this week where I really do consider Utah one of the 4 teams, Vancouver, Calgary, St. Louis, and Utah, really vying for that final playoff berth, because the top 7, and I think that's the real story in the Western Conference, the top 7, which includes teams like Vegas and Edmonton, and certainly in Utah's division, Winnipeg and Minnesota and Dallas and Colorado, they have so entrenched themselves ahead of that final 8th playoff spot that it really is just going to come down to those 4 teams. And I think the frustrating thing, if you're Utah, like when I'm looking at these 4 teams, I think Vancouver has the most talent today, but I don't really think Utah is all that far behind. And they've gotten incredible performance in the goaltending department to start the year, combined with their young players really outperforming at the top of their lineup. And, as of today, despite going 2-6-2 in their last 10 games, they are outscoring teams at even strength, which is the number one predictor for whether a team will go to the postseason or not. But you hit the nail on the head. Injuries, not just cluster injuries on the blue line, but impactful injuries at the top of the lineup. Dylan Guenther, obviously, the top of that list, have really thinned out the talent that is available on a nightly basis. You've seen a lot more line blendering. And I think more concerningly, you've seen the middle 6 or bottom 6 forwards that really have been getting beat up to some degree in the first half of the year. They're having to play more minutes against tougher competition. That is not necessarily a recipe for success. And I really think that's a key reason why Utah has been struggling over the last 10, 15 games.
No doubt about that. You also look at the fact that this team's played on the road more than any team in the league. There might have been a team that jumped up there with them recently, but for the most part in the last couple of weeks, they've been the most road-weary team in the NHL. Is that something that you think can help them? Because we look at their home record, and it actually hasn't been that great.
Well, yeah. So it's kind of funny. And by the way, speaking of teams with home records that aren't great, when you get done with this segment, go take a look at the Vancouver Canucks on home ice this year. So they are very much in a similar boat as Utah. But I'll tell you one thing. I think you ask any player A to Z, I don't care what your home record is in the last 50, 100 games, you always want to be playing on home ice, and there's a reason for it. It's the comfort of home. It's the comfort of the crowd behind you. Utah's obviously struggled to some degree on home ice this year, but one, they're not alone, and two, more importantly, I do think there is, especially when you go through periods where you have a heavy volume of travel coupled with injuries and cluster injuries at a given position, boy, that can build up the fatigue in a hurry. And I think this is an even more reason why you want to be on home ice, especially for an opponent tonight coming in, which, Montreal might be 2,000 miles away, but they're similarly situated to this Utah team. They have been in a multi-year rebuild. Obviously, Utah carrying on from what Arizona was trying to build in Phoenix. The rebuild has been a challenge. They've been toiling the bottom of the Eastern Conference for several years. But all of a sudden, the Canadiens have gotten hot, right? And I actually think their record is now on par with Utah, and I believe they've won seven or 8 of their last 10 games. So even they're, to the extent that Utah is really on let's say a 30-day decline, if there's any team that's surging around the NHL right now, it's Montreal. So you got to take the good with the bad. You got the good. You're playing at home ice in front of your crowd. You got the bad. You do have a hot opponent coming in here that will be game for this matchup.
It's funny because in every sport you kind of do this, and it has never and everything's new for us, right? For this season, we've talked to you about that a bunch. Where it's like, all right, we're trying to figure out the in and out breathing, of this beast that is the NHL regular season, and when teams roll in the NBA, you kind of go, yeah, that should be a winnable game. That should be a winnable game. We've tried to do that with hockey too, and be like, look, the next 3 games for this hockey club, you can win these games, and it's like. You say that a bunch, and they haven't been doing it, and then at the same time, they're winning games that people look at and go, how did they win that game? And that seems to be something that doesn't happen in the other big sports. Is that just something that is it's just kind of unique to maybe this Utah hockey club, or is it just that good a parity in the NHL?
There is a lot of parity in the NHL, and let me emphasize this, especially when you are comparing it to the NBA. Like, these two leagues could not be multiple. There are multiple universes apart at this point. I'll give you an example. Many years ago, when I was younger and less gray, several people took a look at how many games does it actually take for talent to overcome random chance or luck in the standings. This is about 10, 15 years ago. For the NBA, it was only 14 games. So effectively a month into the season, you were already starting to see the cream of the crop rise to the top of the divisions, and they would generally hold their positions throughout, the rest of the regular season where your minnows really sink. And that's a problem the NBA has to deal with, right? You got a lot of markets that are tuned off of their teams by January, February when they're really struggling, unless they have a compelling reason to watch. The NHL, especially because of the third point and the overtime implications, it takes 73 games on an 82-game season for talent to overcome luck in the standings. And the number one thing that I recommend, especially to people who either casually getting into the sport or let's say casual observers, especially many people in Salt Lake who may have casually watched the sport, now you're watching every single night, never fixate on single-game outcomes because you'll pull the hair out of your head. I mean, I just watched a Rangers team that has printed bad news for the first 3 months of the season on an every single day basis. Go into T-Mobile and beat the Golden Knights. It's like that. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on which way you're looking through it, that happens more frequently. And the way I always think about team is how are you performing in chunks? How are you performing in 2-3 week stretches? Because that's where noise has less of an impact. It's just a very low-scoring, lower-event game in the NHL where, 3 or 4 goals on average is going to be enough to win a game in the NHL. In the NBA, you're making 40, 45 field goals on a nightly basis, right? So the NHL is much more sensitive to random chance outcomes. Does that mean at the end of the year the best teams aren't in the playoffs? Of course not. It just takes a lot longer to get there, and you hit the nail on the head. A big reason why is single-game variances can be crazy in the NHL.
You just wrote about that last wild card spot and the teams chasing it. Of those 4 teams, the Flames, Canucks, Blues, and Utah Hockey Club, who do you think has the best chance and the best odds of locking up that last spot?
It's a fascinating question. I don't think Calgary is well equipped to chase this down, and I would probably put them last. And I'm not really impressed with St. Louis's roster. I thought it was would have been, if you asked me a month ago, I thought it would have been a reasonably tight race with Vancouver and then Utah in that order. I still think there's a chance that Utah can get into that, let's say, de facto 9th spot and make this a bit more of a race, but they need to start picking up some points in a hurry. And the problem that I see from Utah's perspective, you're struggling at the wrong time. I mean, you are giving the front office, right, wrong, or otherwise, every reason to say, you know what, this season was found money to begin with. We can trade a couple of veterans right now and keep stocking the cupboards because this offseason we are going to have an exorbitant amount of cap space in a league experiencing pretty good year-over-year revenue growth where that should raise the cap. Utah can be as aggressive as they practically want this summer. I know that's not what people want to hear, but to me, that's the beauty of where you're at right now. It's January 14th. The players on this that are making up this lineup today have about a 4 to 6 week tryout to show, hey, look, we can actually get back into this race and contend with Vancouver for that last spot. But again, you watch the last month or so of play, and it's just left you wanting. I certainly don't think they are putting playoff hockey on display right now. But to some degree, you understand injuries have really ravaged this team in a challenging way right now. Unfortunately, I do think if the losing continues, I do think that will inform Utah's at least short-term decision-making for this season. We'll see about that. But by the way, like we talked about, I emphasize top 7 because if you're Vancouver and you think, okay, we still have the most talent of these four teams across the roster. We just got Thatcher Demko, a superstar goalie, back. We'll be okay. I mean, you got to look at it from the front office of the Vancouver Canucks perspective, which is best case scenario, I'm drawing into an all-time gauntlet round one. Does it even make sense for our organization to be buyers come the trade deadline March 8th? I do think that is the fascinating part of the NHL schedule that we're entering into right now, and several big decisions for several big teams coming up in the West.
Travis, one of the things I'm trying to figure out with the NHL too is the insane money, right, that is thrown at guys. I think when I was, a lot, I mean, this must have been at this point 10 or 12 or maybe even 15 years ago. Ilya Kovalchuk, remember when he signed that, like, it was like a 20-year deal or something like that with the Devils? There was like a 15 or 18-year deal. And I'm like, this is such a hockey contract to me, right? Like, it won because the money is not as insane as we're getting. And this is the thing we complain about for the other big sports. But where's hockey's collective bargaining agreement and the money that are paid to these athletes kind of going direction-wise? Obviously, you've got just things going up and up and up because TV contracts are worth more and more and more these days. But where does hockey kind of live in that world of long-term contracts, guaranteed money, and all that compared to these other leagues that we follow?
Yeah, there's a couple of really interesting, I would say, variances or differences between like what people in Salt Lake and the NBA would be accustomed to versus the NHL. NBA, you've got the soft cap, you got a luxury tax that allows teams to really balloon their salary. Fundamentally different in the NHL, right? You've got a hard salary cap. People who are anti-Vegas Golden Knights fans would say, well, certain teams use tools like long-term injured reserve to skirt the salary cap ceiling. That's a little bit more in the weeds of the CBA. But
last year it was we got to get Arizona to spend above the floor. Let's go here.
Well, so it's funny. I'll spare you the long version of this, but if you go back, there was probably a 3-year stretch where I spent a lot of time covering the Coyotes, but also before the financial and business vehicle that I thought that they were routinely, and this is before the late stages of the Coyotes that I think everyone was kind of aware of what was going on. They were using LTIR to just stay above the salary cap floor on a yearly basis, and any guy who developed a skin rash, Koff, Marian Hossa, or Pavel Datsyuk, Shea Weber. I mean, the Hall of Fame that the Coyotes could have sent through over the years was incredible, but these guys never played a single game for them. That said, in terms of like contracts and where they're going, I think one of the interesting things in the NHL is because you have a hard cap, teams really – it's a zero-sum game. So teams really have to chew on, I think, to a larger degree, how aggressive am I willing to go on an average annual value for a star and or a superstar player because of the ramifications it'll have for the rest of my lineup. And you see that, you've seen that over the years with a team like the Edmonton Oilers, who I think are very well positioned right now to win a Stanley Cup. But for many years, they've had to challenge with, we have McDavid and Draisaitl, who, by the way, they're coming up on new contracts, consuming such an exorbitant piece of the cap that we only really have peanuts on a relative basis to deploy through the rest of the roster. And it's why for many years you heard people rightly critical of Edmonton being a very top-heavy team. Other teams are less willing to go to the high end of what that contract range that can be anywhere from $13, $14, $15 million a year. They're less willing to go that route because they want more money to spend across the rest of the roster. Problem you have there is you have less confidence in that player's longer-term ability. Superstars are superstars for a reason. And that's why they command the big bucks. So I actually, that part of the salary cap, there's many things that we could honestly go for 6 hours about the NHL CBA. I'll probably bore your audience to tears. But one of the things that I really do like about the NHL, or I've grown to like more over the years, I do like the hard cap. I do wish that they would fix the LTIR loophole. But I do think the hard cap in a league where all 32 teams are reasonably willing to spend, I do think it creates the good degree of parity that the league wants, and I think that's a good thing.
Utah Hockey Club in desperate need of good news, and they got some today that John Marino will be in the lineup tonight for the first time this season, and an acquisition this summer around the draft that they got from New Jersey that's going to help their blue line. We haven't seen him yet, but what are they going to get from him, and how important is that addition now with all the injuries they have?
It's pretty big, especially since he's coming on the blue line. I mean, you've seen a lot of it goes. One of the big areas of risk that an NHL team deals with, and this is common in the NFL too. But when you have cluster injuries at a given position, it really forces guys to manage more minutes against much tougher competition, and usually in an area they are very uncomfortable with. It's pretty rare that you see a team deal with cluster injuries like Utah has to a large degree on the blue line, for example, and succeed long term. You just have guys playing out of position, guys playing offhand, whatever the case is. He's another veteran who brings tremendous stability. I mean, John Marino is a guy who's not going to blow your defensive structure on a shift by shift basis, which is the type of concern you have when you're bringing in 6th, 7th, 8th defenders into the lineup, and even in some cases putting them inside of the top 4 against some of the best forwards in the league. He's got an incredible degree of awareness on the ice, spatial awareness. He knows when to play aggressively. On player, off the puck. I think more than anything, he is at least one piece of stability that this team really needs right now. The other thing that I mentioned it earlier, you understand why the coaching staff is doing it, but they are blendering the lines like crazy right now, trying to figure out what works. Last game they went with a very top-heavy lineup with, I think they played Cooley with Keller quite a bit. We've seen that a little bit more lately, but again, those guys come off, and the majority of the time they are not playing, which means you need an insulated lineup, especially on the defensive side of the ice, and a guy like Marino certainly helps that along.
Travis Yost, he's been helping us through this entire season of figuring out some of these teams. There's not a question that we've thrown at him that he hasn't answered phenomenally. And tonight it's the Montreal Canadiens in town, and he's going to be covering this one. And welcome to Delta Center, Travis, and have a fun time tonight, man. We're looking forward to this one. Hopefully the hockey club can get right at home here.
Hey, I appreciate that. Your check's in the mail for phenomenally answered questions, by the way. I appreciate that.
No,
Thanks, boys.
Awesome job. Yeah, we appreciate it. Travis Yost, everybody. There you go. TSN. You can follow him on Twitter.